establishment of colonial rule in Kenya. That is the topic that we have been handling. And in our today's lesson, we are going to be studying the company rule in Kenya. That is how, or after the partitioning of Africa, which we learned in our previous lesson of East Africa, East Africa, Britain got her territory, which he declared to be the British East African or the British East African Protectorate, which she decided to administer. And to administer that territory, companies were used. So the company of the Imperial British East African Company was used to administer the territory that had been acquired by the Britain. So this one is abbreviated as IBEACO. That is the Imperial British East African Company. So this is the company that was given the charter. The company was given the charter to administer. They were given the charter to administer the protectorate, or Kenya, on behalf of British government. They were given this one should be a small letter, on behalf of the British government, because it would be so much costly for the government to administer the protectorate on directly. So the company, the Imperial British East African Company, was given the charter, or was given the power to administer or manage Kenya, or the British protectorate, on behalf of the Kenyan of the British government. So the rights were given to this company to do everything on behalf of the government. This happened in 1888. That is when the company was given the rights, or the charter, to administer the British protectorate on behalf of the British. So immediately the company got that charter, it leased out the land to the interior to Sultan, so that it leased the land from Sultan, so that they could advance, or they could invest, or make profits. Remember, this is a company that has been given that territory, so they are using it for their own economic importance. So let us first discuss the aims of IBEA, or the aims of the Imperial British East African Company. What were the goals? What did they need? Why was it important for them to get this territory and to administer that territory? The first one, they were to maintain law and order. They were supposed to maintain law and order. That was their first aim, or their first goal. They were supposed to maintain law and order in the territory. So their mandate was to make sure that the territory that was declared a German sphere of influence. Remember, during the Berlin Conference, one of the terms of that conference, or the Berlin Conference, was that a company that had declared a sphere of influence had to follow that declaration with effective occupation. Effective occupation. So they had to effectively occupy. What does it mean to effectively occupy? There had to be uh, uh, law and order in that territory. So the first order of business of the Imperial British East African Company was to maintain law and order. And then number two, they were to counter. It was to counter the influence of the French, the Germans, and Italy, who are also interested in these areas. So the Imperial British East African Company was given the role or the mandate of countering the influence of the Germans, especially, who are the biggest rivals in this area to the British. So the other aim or the other goal for them was to counter the spread or the influence of those countries. Number three, they were to control and develop trade. They were to control and develop trade and trading activities. They had to make sure that there was effective trade activities in that area. The communities, or they were able to exploit the resources. They were able to get control of the trading activities in the territory. That was the next aim. The fourth one, that is number 4, they were to collect. They were supposed to levy, not just collect. They were supposed to levy. Allow me to wrap that. They were supposed to levy and collect taxes on the territory. That was the next work of the Imperial British East African Company, or the next aim or goal of the company. They were supposed to levy, that is, to apportion the taxes that are required, and then number 2, to collect those taxes for the benefit or for the influence of the company. And then lastly, they were supposed to advocate for the end of slave trade. They were supposed to abolish slave trade in that territory. They were supposed to make sure that the slave trade that had started happening, that was led by the Sultan at the coast, has now been avoided, or had now been brought to an end. So those were the aims of this company as it occupied the territory of Kenya. Remember, Britain is occupying this land. They have made an agreement as nations, but as a government, they are not able to come and occupy that land physically. So they use this company to control the territory. So those were the aims. Now, as they were making these, as they were controlling and exercising their authority over this territory, they had several achievements. Now, that is the next thing we are going to look at, the achievements. The achievements of Imperial British East African Company, the achievements of Imperial British East African Company. So the first one is that they were able to suppress. They were able to suppress the revolts by traditional communities. They were able to suppress the revolts by traditional communities. So as they took control or took authority in those territories, most African communities did not accept, so they had to stand up against them, but they managed to quench or bring an end to those rebellions. Number two, they laid a foundation. The company laid a foundation. They laid a foundation for the coming of the colonial administration. So they laid structures that later could come and be used by the British government during the direct control. And then number three, they freed many slaves. Freed slaves. They freed slaves. So as we mentioned, they had to advocate for the end of slavery. That was an aim, or that was a need that they had to be able to accomplish. So they freed a lot of slaves who are enslaved, especially at the coast. And these brought most of the people back to their homes. Apart from that, they started construction of roads. Construction of roads along the trade routes. The trade routes where the trading activities were happening. These they expanded by creating roads or constructing roads. They financed the construction of roads. So these enabled or made way for the government later on, the colonial administrators, to come and use the same roads or advance the same roads as during the time of occupation. And then lastly, they started early industries. They started early industries. As remember, they had to undertake trading activities. So in their trade, they had to start industries. For example, the weaving, the textile industry was initiated by this company. So to make sure that the cotton that was being grown was now being put into place. So the earliest industries were set up by the Imperial British East African Company. So those are some of the achievements that were able to be acquired by the company that was acting on behalf of the British government. So even with those achievements, the Imperial British East African Company made a lot of significant influence because they effectively occupied this land, this territory of Kenya. It was effectively occupied and led by the Imperial British East African Company. So they made several forts or centers of administration. That is another, you could also mention another influence or another impact made by the British East African Company. So they made forts. They made forts, which were also referred to as bombers, at different areas where they could store trade commodities, where they could live. So these forts included, they had made one at Kismayu. They also made another one at Malindi. Another one was made at Vanga. Another one was made at Witu. another one was made at Machakos, another one was made at Fort Smith, and lastly, there was a fort in Mumias. So these are administrative centers that were created by the Imperial British East African Company. So these ensured that they could easily control, or they could easily manage the territory. Yes, despite of them making those achievements, they also encountered some problems. So they had problems. So the problems faced by Imperial British East African Company. What are these problems that they faced in establishing their control? The first one is that they did not have enough manpower. They did not have manpower. They did not have enough manpower. They did not have enough leaders to effectively control or to carry out their activities or their objectives. So that was a very significant problem or challenge that they had faced. And then most Africans were resistance. Most of the African communities resisted the advancement or the work of the Imperial British East Africa. So there were frequent revolts, and for them to quench, or for the British or for the company to quench this resistance, they required a lot of resources. They had to invest a lot of money to quench those rebellions. That was very costly on their land. And also, the land was too big. The land was too vast. So you can imagine, from the coast towards the interior, the Imperial British East Africa was responsible for both Kenya and Uganda, right? And part of Somali. So that was a very huge chunk of land to be managed by one company. So that was another challenge. And then there was poor transport system. Poor transport. There were no elaborate road system. They did not have established roads where they could move on every now and then. And then also, they did not have navigable rivers. They did not have navigable. There were no navigable rivers that could ease the movement of, or the carrying of trade items. So that required them carrying or employing a lot of laborers to transport their commodities. And then there was low trading activities. There were low trading activities between the people of the coast and the people of the interior. So the trade volume was very low. So that meant that they did not make as higher profits as they had anticipated. That was a problem or a challenge on their side. And then lastly, the last problem that they faced was that it was so expensive. It was very expensive